Herophilus, an ancient physician, is often called the father of anatomy for his significant contributions to understanding how the human body works. He practiced medicine in Alexandria, Egypt, and had a unique way of learning about the internal workings of the human body. During the rule of the first two Ptolemaic pharaohs in Alexandria, which lasted around 30 to 40 years, Herophilus was allowed to publicly dissect human bodies along with another Greek physician named Erasistratus. Interestingly, under Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, criminals could be punished with dissection and vivisection, and Herophilus is said to have dissected the dead and performed vivisection on approximately 600 living prisoners. In a time when dissecting human bodies was considered disrespectful, Herophilus made significant advancements in the study of human anatomy. He focused on various body parts such as the brain, eyes, liver, circulatory system, nervous system, and reproductive system. It's important to note that during this era, conducting autopsies on the deceased was not common, although mummification was popular in Egypt. Additionally, performing vivisection on living bodies was viewed as a brutal practice, much like it is today. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol banned the use of biological warfare, but Japan didn't agree with the ban. They thought if germ warfare was effective enough to be banned, then it must work. This led to the creation of Unit 731, a secret facility in Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Unit 731, publicly known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit, began experimenting with pathogenic and chemical warfare in the mid-1930s. Military leaders intentionally exposed victims, mainly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, to deadly diseases like anthrax, bubonic plague, cholera, syphilis, and typhus. The aim was to understand how these diseases affected the body and how they could be used in bombs and attacks during World War II. Disturbingly, Unit 731 also conducted horrific experiments on people, including dissections and vivisections on living humans, all without anesthesia because the experimenters believed it would affect the research results. The victims weren't limited to one nationality, anyone who wasn't Japanese could be a subject. The death toll from Unit 731 is estimated to be around 100,000 people within the facility, but when you include field experiments like dropping plague-infected fleas over Chinese villages and poisoning wells with cholera, the numbers rise to estimates closer to 250,000 or possibly more. Shockingly, after World War II, the US granted immunity to those involved in these war crimes as part of an information exchange agreement. Even until the 1980s, the Japanese government denied the existence of Unit 731 and its gruesome activities. In history, the CIA carried out secret mind control experiments that you might have thought were only in movies like Men Who Stare at Goats or The Manchurian Candidate. But, in reality, during the Cold War, the CIA conducted covert experiments under the MKUltra project. The goal was to create controlled, super agents who could carry out missions without being affected by enemy interrogations. The CIA researchers experimented on unsuspecting Americans and Canadians by giving them psychedelic drugs like LSD, PCP, and barbiturates. They also used illegal methods like hypnosis and, possibly, chemical, biological, and radiological agents. Some universities unknowingly participated by acting as a delivery system. Shockingly, around 7,000 soldiers were involved in the research without their consent, according to the US Department of Veterans Affairs. Lasting for more than 20 years, the project cost around $20 million. Although one death was directly linked to the project, more were suspected. In 1973, the CIA destroyed most of the records associated with the MKUltra project, leaving behind a disturbing chapter in the agency's history. In the movie Ghostbusters, the character Peter Venkman is shown conducting electroshock experiments on college students. This fictional character was likely inspired by the real-life experiments of social psychologist Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s. Milgram's experiments involved teachers who thought they were part of a study on memory and learning. These teachers were asked to administer electric shocks to learners, actors, unbeknownst to the teachers, whenever they made mistakes on word-matching quizzes. The catch was that no real shocks were given, and the experiment was actually about how obedient people are to authority. In the end, about 2/3 of the teachers delivered what they believed to be the highest voltage shocks, following the instructions of the experimenter. While some criticize the experiments for lacking realism, others see the results as important in understanding human behavior under pressure. In a repeat of the study in 2010, around 70% of participants obediently administered what they believed to be the highest voltage shocks, highlighting the ongoing controversy and discussion surrounding Milgram's shocking experiments. Living in South Africa during the apartheid era meant facing state-enforced racial segregation, and it came with additional hardships, including the government's control over your sexuality. The South African government had strict laws against homosexuality, viewing it as deviant and even a treatable disease. Even after the understanding of homosexuality changed, some psychiatrists and medical professionals in the South African Defence Force, SADF, clung to outdated beliefs. They continued to use aversion therapy, a method debunked for curing homosexuality, particularly on prisoners and those forced into the military under conscription laws. One disturbing example occurred at Ward 22 in one military hospital in Pretoria between 1969 and 1987. The staff attempted to cure perceived deviance, which included homosexuals, gay men, and lesbians. These individuals were drugged and subjected to electroconvulsive behavior therapy while being exposed to aversion stimuli like same-sex erotic photos, followed by images of the opposite sex after electric shocks. When this harmful technique failed, which it did, victims were then subjected to hormone therapy, sometimes involving chemical castration. Additionally, approximately 900 men and women underwent gender reassignment surgery when attempts to reorient them failed, often without their consent, and some left incomplete. These practices reflect a painful and unjust chapter in South Africa's history. During World War II, about 60 to 65% of American soldiers stationed in the South Pacific faced malaria infections. It was a big problem, sometimes more deadly than the enemy forces. So, finding a good treatment was crucial for winning the war. In 1944, for 2 years, over 400 prisoners at the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois took part in an experiment to find an effective malaria drug. The prisoners were intentionally infected with malaria and then treated with experimental antimalarial drugs. The experiment was not kept secret, and despite its questionable methods, the American public, focused on winning the war, didn't seem bothered. The participants were aware of the experiment's purpose and were praised for their patriotism. In many cases, they even received shorter prison sentences for being part of the study. The goal was to keep the troops safe and healthy during the war. Stuttering, a condition where speech is disrupted by repetitions or prolonged sounds, has various causes. It can be linked to family history or brain injuries like strokes. Some children may stutter while learning to talk, but often outgrow it. In rare cases, emotional trauma may contribute. However, one thing it is not caused by is criticism. In 1939, Mary Tudor and speech expert Wendell Johnson from the University of Iowa conducted an experiment to show that stuttering could be learned through negative feedback. They worked with 22 orphan children over 4 months, telling them they were getting speech therapy, but only half actually stuttered, and none received real therapy. The children were divided into 4 groups. 1. Half of the stutterers received negative feedback. 2. The other half of stutterers received positive feedback. 3. Half of the non-stutterers were told they were starting to stutter and were criticized. 4. The other half of non-stutterers were praised. The only noticeable impact was on the 3rd group. Even though they never developed a stutter, these children began acting differently, showing low self-esteem and adopting behaviors associated with stuttering. Those who did stutter didn't stop, no matter the feedback they received. This experiment, though attempting to link criticism to stuttering, did not provide accurate results. In 1920, John Watson and graduate student Rosalie Rayner conducted an experiment at Johns Hopkins University on a 9-month-old baby known as Albert B. They wanted to prove their idea that people are born with blank slates that can be shaped. Albert's mother, who was a wet nurse at the hospital, was paid $1 to allow her son to participate. Here's what happened in the Little Albert experiment. At first, the researchers showed Albert a small, furry white rat, and he wasn't scared of it. Then, they introduced the rat along with a loud sound. They repeated this process until Albert became afraid of any small, furry animal, like rats, dogs, and monkeys, no matter if there was a loud noise or not. Found out who Albert really was in 2010, when his identity was revealed as Douglas Merritt. Sadly, Douglas wasn't a healthy child. He had behavioral and neurological issues, never learned to talk or walk, and passed away at the age of 6 due to hydrocephalus, water on the brain. There are suspicions that he might have been intentionally infected during treatments or as part of another experiment. Douglas was never UN conditioned, and because he died so young, we don't know if his fear of small furry things continued after the experiment. The Little Albert experiment is troubling, and its impact on Douglas Merritt's life is a tragic part of its history. During World War II, the Nazis conducted cruel medical experiments on people held in concentration camps like Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. These prisoners endured terrible abuse, mutilation, starvation, and torture. The Nazis claimed these experiments were for military, medical, and racial purposes. For instance, Jewish prisoners were used in experiments to help the military. Some were subjected to freezing cold water to see how long a downed pilot could survive in similar conditions. Others were given only seawater to study how pilots might endure at sea, but sadly, they died of dehydration. Some were put in high-altitude chambers, and after, their brains were dissected while they were still alive to study the effects of high-altitude sickness on pilots. The Nazis were also interested in finding better ways to treat war injuries, so they tested drugs in the camps. They used sulfanilamide to treat wounds, intentionally infecting victims to study the effects. They also studied infections, poisonings, and injected tuberculosis into prisoners to understand how to protect against it. Poison experiments were conducted to see how quickly people would die. Additionally, the Nazis performed experiments based on genetics and race, including sterilizations, artificial inseminations, and tests on twins and people of short stature. These acts were part of the Nazis' disturbing and inhumane practices during the war. Please like and subscribe for more other content.